Hello and welcome to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill. I am still your host, Ramsey Nasser. This is our first episode with a new name, marking over 5 years of this podcast. Going forward, we're broadening our focus beyond the humanities to all fields of research, and we'll be discussing sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond. And to start us off, today, we address the limits of inclusion in higher education, the tokenism, the optics, and what true diversity could look like. Stay with us. Diversity and sustainability are deeply interconnected. If sustainability is about creating systems that can endure, few things are less resilient than homogeneity. In academia, diversity refers to more than just intellectual diversity, but also specifically to the personal backgrounds and experiences that inform one's intellectual work: race, class, gender, physical ability, and other variables, and specifically their position relative to power. In what ways does one belong to a dominant or privileged groups? And in what ways does one belong to the subaltern or the marginal? What limits are placed on bringing one's whole self into one's intellectual practice? And how do these limits impoverish the whole? It must not be for nothing that this word, diversity, has endured for so long at the center of collective conversation. How does it serve power? What do diversity and inclusion as concepts do, and what don't they do? What are their limits? And if diversity and inclusion are not enough, then what should accompany them or replace them? To help us answer these questions and so much more about the limits of inclusion, we are honored to welcome Dr. Nimisha Barton. She is author of Diversity Practitioners and Institutional Whiteness, which is a chapter in her book, Just Future: Getting from Diversity and Inclusion to Equity and Justice in Higher Education, published by Cornell University Press, a partner of de Gruyter Brill. Dr. Barton, I am so happy to have you on the show and for you to be our first guest on Sustainability Matters. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel very honored that I'm the first guest. So let's grill me. Let's do this.
First one, bit easy just to set us up and ease us into the subject matter. Your work focuses on historically white colleges and universities, HWCUs. Why did you choose to focus there? To what degree are the problems you describe limited to historically white colleges and universities?
So for those who are unfamiliar with this term, historically white colleges and universities tend to, as a term among education scholars, refer to universities that have been around for a really long time, right? Since the 17th century, your typical Ivy plus group of colleges, your Princeton, your Cornell, your Yale, that sort of thing. That being said, I have a slightly more expanded understanding of HWCUs as not just sort of the early Ivies, but really all institutions that were created, founded, established over the course of the 18th and 19th and even early 20th century. The most important for me when it comes to defining and understanding what is a historically white college and university is thinking about its investments and entanglements with systems of white supremacy and institutional whiteness. And so what that means for me is that in a lot of ways, apart from HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, apart from tribal colleges, most institutions are HWCUs. You find the dynamics of white supremacy and institutional whiteness most acutely in the older universities, just because of the weight of tradition, which is something I talk about in the book. But it's a culture that thrives everywhere, even in diminished form, even, quote unquote, even at minority serving institutions, right? Human remains of Native Americans, you'll find those at UC Berkeley. You'll find those at Princeton. You'll find them at Yale. But this is something that you'll find at other institutions too. And that's because of the way fundamentally they've been built in relation to communities and notions of superiority and inferiority. Who's in these institutions, who's worthy of these institutions, and who's not. So that's my understanding of HWCUs writ large.
Amazing. Great. That really broadens the focus. So just to jump into it, you refer to Sarah Ahmed in your chapter in the book, and she has written that historically white colleges and universities, quote, showcase their DEI, diversity and inclusion hires, and the existence of DEI positions as evidence that they're, quote, doing something about racism and other systems of oppression. Use high-profile DEI positions and people of color who occupy them can become more about changing the image of a thing, in this case, the universities, rather than changing the thing itself. HWCUs and their leaders may, unintentionally or otherwise, engage in tokenization, that is, symbolic gestures of showcasing those with marginalized identities as a way of deflecting criticism that an organization is behind the times, end quote. I've read elsewhere, I can't remember where at the moment, that corporate diversity training programs only exist to shield companies and senior executives from legal liabilities for institutional racism, and that they allow them to show before the courts that they're taking some sort of action and therefore not negligent or condoning of racism in their midst, while in fact doing precisely that, permitting institutional racism in the organization. Do you agree with that legal shield hypothesis, or is there a bigger cultural phenomenon happening?
When I was first thinking about this question, I really wanted to lean into the messiness of it, to say something that was radically more hopeful, to say something along the lines of people's motives are messy, and maybe through the use of that legal liability argument, individuals, groups within organizations can do good work. They have genuine interest in creating organizational change within these racialized organizations. So I wanted to say that. But then I also think that this legal liability, the preemptive strike argument, it's sort of given new life in this particular moment because we are in very many ways the opposite political climate, right? So there once, and at times it happens, it exists, it pops its head out, it disappears. But yeah, for the last 20 something years, we were in a climate where organizations would be punished for institutional racism. And so these companies had to, quite frankly, wash their asses. We are, for the second time now in, 8 years, entering a period where institutions are going to get nailed for precisely having those kinds of programs. And so you see this thing happening where places like, Microsoft has already begun to dismantle its DEI programs, right, in anticipation of the new political landscape. I think the new political landscape is also of a piece with the Supreme Court decision around affirmative action. In other words, it sort of just looks like organizations and corporations are just interested in, covering their butts in keeping with whatever is the political imperative of the moment. I still want to believe that there are people inside and I do believe that there are people inside organizations that want to do this good work. They'll just have to, like everybody else, find other ways to do it, as we have in the past.
Yeah. You write in the chapter, I'm going to quote you a lot in these questions. You write so well and state the case so clearly. You write, quote, "The power-blind diversity regime feeds institutional whiteness, constrains diversity practitioners at all levels, and ultimately prevents historically white colleges and universities from responding to the imperative for change. Diversity practitioners thus find themselves in an odd position. Their success with students depends on their awareness of structural oppression at large, and yet their professional success depends on operating within a power-blind diversity regime at work," end quote. So I have a lot of questions here, and I think collectively they kind of get to the heart of your argument. How do you conceptualize institutional whiteness? How does the eliding of the existence of power assist power in its own reproduction? And finally, how much of your critique is about race specifically versus broader dynamics of self-serving power structures that posture as inclusive in order to exclude? Or are you specifically focused on the racial practice of that phenomenon, if you follow?
Yes. So I'm going to answer in reverse order. I think for me, one of the most important things was just to bring to bear a power analysis to institutions. A power analysis, I think, can be adaptable to thinking about any power imbalance, whether we're thinking about sexism, heterosexism, classism within organizations. For me, sort of the racial inequity was most important. So I use a lot of terminology around power blindness, which is a concept I got from an education scholar named Angela Castano, called educated in whiteness. But at the end of the day, I'm most concerned with race in this book. I will occasionally talk about gender and religion, ethnicity, sexuality, and that sort of thing, but only because I think that the overall overarching framework of power blindness is adaptable for just about anything. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say has to do with, so what is the relationship between power blindness and institutional whiteness, right? So the way I define institutional whiteness, here I'm also drawing on a lot of sociologists of race, education scholars that are thinking through the ways that histories of white supremacy have yielded a variety of policies and practices and cultures that are steeped in the histories of race-based, sex-based, whatever you want to call it, exclusions, right? So for example, imagine the example that I gave you before about holding on to human remains of Native Americans that were collected by universities in the 19th century. Like, what is the ethos? What is the way of imagining a university and the people that populate a university in relation to historically marginalized students that allows for something like that to continue even into the 21st century, right? That's an example of institutional whiteness at the level of culture, certainly, but also policy and practice. What policies and practices allowed for something like that to happen? What policies and practices allowed it to continue? Another more concrete example, legacy admissions, right? Legacy admissions, which disproportionately favor quote unquote traditional students, so continuing generation, students from wealthier backgrounds, and disproportionately white students, right? That, as I explain in the book, that itself has histories rooted in the postbellum period, the Civil War period, right? Ways to ensure that students, or rather young men, young white men from the South, would continue to be able to have assured spots in these institutions, right? And a varieties of admissions practices that that are rooted in that period. So those are some concrete examples of institutional whiteness that draw on these sort of bigger concepts that sociologists and other education scholars have given to us. I might, however, need a little bit more explanation on this question about how does the alighting of the existence of power assist power in its reproduction? I'm not sure I understand that question.
Like, you speak specifically of power blindness and the power blind regime constraining diversity practitioners, specifically in a way to prevent them from realizing or pushing for more equitable outcomes within the institution. So something about the regime of power feigning awareness of its own power, taking it off the tables of discussion, enables it to exercise its power more efficiently or ferociously or whatnot. I mean, it sounds like an important part of your argument. I was just curious about how you theorize that.
Let me think this through with you. I think there's a very natural and useful corollary when we think about the scholarship on race blindness by sociologists like Eduardo Bonilla Silva. So what happens in this is his thesis, that after the Civil War, really after World War II, but certainly after the Civil Rights Movement, overt racism is no longer allowed. It's no longer on the table. We all understand in the United States that that's a big no-no. However, that racism kind of goes underground with this notion of, sorry, not race blindness, color blindness is what he refers to it as, right? This notion that I don't see race. Well, that's silly. We all see race, right? And so, in claiming not to see race, you can push forward a variety of policies that are supposedly race neutral, even though that doesn't exist, right? So, I think that there's a really natural corollary there. Again, this notion of power blindness, which I get from Castano and to a certain extent, J.T. Thomas, who writes of the diversity, and I would say diversity and inclusion regime, is the notion that it's like that, but it's more the idea that if we can water down power, if we can dilute it to the point where we're not really talking about power, but we're talking about these feel-good ideas about multiculturalism and tolerance, and we can all just get along and kumbaya. If we can boil it down to something more superficial that, albeit makes us feel real good about ourselves and everyone else, if we can sort of focus on that bit, then we don't need to talk about the more unsavory bits, which are actually about power, right? Which are about like, what do we owe to one another as a result of historical injustices? Instead, every November, we can celebrate Diwali. And we can add Kwanzaa to the calendar. That's just not the same thing, right? That's not about power. That's about celebrating difference. And that's about celebrating difference under a rubric that is power blind. So I'm not sure I would use exactly the same language that you would. Maybe I'm just, at the end of the day, I would say that I'm not as theoretical. Like, I don't know that I have as sophisticated a theoretical apparatus, but those are the kinds of examples that move me and that drive me and that make me, throughout the book, see or, argue that diversity and inclusion just isn't enough because it lacks the power blindness analysis.
Yeah, that really resonates. I think about France refusing to collect race statistics, which then prevents them from taking any measures to alleviate inequalities between race, because all French citizens are supposedly equal, while manifestly they're not. What was correctly Kwame Ture, who said that peace is the white man's word and that our word is liberation.
I was just going to say that I don't know if you know this, but in a previous life, right before I went into DEI, I was a French historian. And my first book was on immigration, gender, and sexuality in France. And so I'm really steeped in that comparison of the way that the French, quote unquote, do race and quote unquote have done race versus the way that the Americans do race. So I've always found that really fascinating. A lot of scholarship about race in the French Academy is still seen as an American import, an American academic import. And they talk about this even today as le wokisme, right? The wokeism that is infecting the French Academy that comes from the US Academy, because in France, they don't have a race problem. That's an American thing. We're not here to talk about France, but a lot of interesting international comparisons that one can make. France often used as a foil to the U.S. in terms of a more race-blind society, what it would look like to continue to tell yourself and to continue to employ policies and practice that are quote-unquote race-blind, which is something very interesting to U.S. scholars right now as we enter into a political climate where race-blindness is going to become increasingly mandatory.
Wow. Yeah. About 25 years ago, back when we were in, an era which is fast coming to a close, I was working for a big multinational bank, and I was at a corporate event in London, and a senior executive commented that they were so proud to see so much diversity in the room. And nobody said anything except for a colleague of mine next to me who answered that actually she didn't see a lot of diversity in the room at all. That everyone who was there belonged to global families in the economic 10% of their home countries. They all had similar educations in international schools and attended top-tier universities. And the senior executive didn't really reply. The conversation just sort of moved on. But I thought it was a very brave thing of them to say. And I thought about that while reading your chapter. You write about how the notion of managing diversity, quote unquote, rose to popularity in corporate environments first in the 1990s, and that by the mid-1990s, 70% of 50 Fortune 500 companies had diversity management programs. but that you say there were ulterior motives at play. This obsession with collecting and displaying bodies of different colors in historically white colleges and university materials and on their websites was simply a means of deflecting attention away from the abandonment of the fight for social justice. So that is very consistent with your argument. But I wonder if you have any knowledge of how this contamination of a higher education environment specifically with corporate notions of diversity and inclusion took place. Was it just permeating the broader culture? Were there corporate boards of governors that had members that also sat on university board of governors, so they adopted similar strategies? Have you looked into or thought about how that transition occurred?
Absolutely. So as someone who's trained as a historian and who's very, very interested in concrete policies, practices, I am always wary of cultural arguments because undeniably there is a culture, but I want to know how culture seeps into practice, right? And I think I was really fortunate when it came to this particular argument. There has been so much fantastic scholarship on it. So I just sort of dashed off a footnote about, Will Keimlicke, who's done a lot of work on this, Sarah Ahmed, who brought that kind of that kind of argumentation to higher education. I think what we're really talking about is a sociology of the profession, a historical sociology of the profession. As a historian, as a person trained as a historian, if I had it my way, I would love to see those diversity trainings materials from like the 1980s, 90s, 2000s. I'd love to track how they changed. I'd love to talk to the people who originated these trainings, what they were thinking, what they were reading, what they thought was important for people to know. I think, there already are people who have looked at that corporate management stuff. I think right now we're in an interesting moment where there are a lot of like diversity leadership certificates and certifications happening, not just in the corporate world, but also in the higher ed space. So my question is, so now what are they learning? And how are these things being taught? Similarly, I will say that as someone who has worked in the diversity, equity, and inclusion, field in higher education, they would actively tell us at these different conferences and professional gatherings, here's, 5 arguments to mobilize when you are convincing the people in your institution about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They say number 1 is the moral argument. No one cares about that, which is telling. Number 2 is the corporate argument. And the corporate argument is sustained by a number of studies that say things like, when teams are more diverse, their output tends to be better. When white students work more collaboratively with students of color, go to school with students of color, they do better according to all these different metrics, right? So there's that argument. And they call it the business argument, right? The market argument for it. And so the ways that you can take that kind of market argument and literally sell DEI to your organization. So I think just that example it's a poignant example of sort of the cross-pollination between higher ed and corporate settings comes to literally selling DEI in the sense of trying to convince stakeholders who are powerful within institutions that DEI matters and is important, and they need to do it without appealing to a moral sensibility that one cannot always count upon.
Yeah, I have so many questions. About that. But do you think that that's an intrinsic driver, or that's a justification after the fact using contemporary language?
I mean, it's hard to say that it wasn't an intrinsic driver. I mean, when Nike signed Kaepernick, sorry, I'm not a sports person. When they signed Colin Kaepernick, who, as everyone knows, took a knee in solidarity with Black communities. He was a football player, and he was really on this sort of like racial journey of his own as a Black person who was adopted or raised by white parents. Anyways, when he took a knee, he was and continues to be completely iced out of football, because I think they've done a lot of studies on this. Studies journalists have unearthed the fact that a lot of the owners of the football teams are huge Trump proponents, right? So he was persona non grata. He was completely iced out. And then there was this moment, I want to say right after 2020, or in response to 2020, where Nike went on this huge ad campaign, very visibly signing him into their, corporation. And he was in all the ads, all the publicity. This was their way of saying, we're down, we're woke, we're in favor of racial justice and all that stuff, right? And that happened in 2020. That stuff happened also in the 1980s and 1990s. Organizations, they kind of pandered and coming at it from a couple of perspectives. In the first place, there were these huge untapped markets of people of color with money to spend that they were accessing. So it was very sort of capitalist, right? And also a recognition that if these organizations could feature more of these brightly, these different colored, these, polychromatic faces in their advertisements, they could actually appeal to more people into those markets, right? And then when multiculturalism became this like very exciting thing, we always got commercials with like 4 white people, but always 1 Black person too, right?
Yes. Always.
Yeah, it's been there for a while. It's not new. I think we saw it rear its head again in 2020. I think that there are people who say, hey, it's something. And there are people who feel a lot more pessimistic about it, which are just like, it's something, but it's just co-optation and aesthetic, and it's not real and it's hollow. And I think in moments like this, when you see places like really preemptively dissolve all those DEI programs that they were so quick to implement and institute in 2020 or 2014, 15, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, I think it's hard not to be a bit jaded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing that sounds like a nightmare, something you say in the book, you write, quote, diversity practitioners are managing microaggressions on behalf of students while navigating microaggressions themselves. These working conditions are hardly conducive to doing one's job effectively, end quote. I mean, that sounds absolutely like a horrendous position to be in, to be the point person on campus to ensure and defend and develop diversity, equity, and inclusion. And yet, for the students there, and yet you yourself to be suffering under overt and inovert racial attacks, it makes me wonder, how prevalent is that dynamic? How strong is it? And if it is prevalent and strong, what on earth would motivate these DEI practitioners on campus to take on these jobs under those conditions? Do they understand their own work as challenging power systems, or do they understand themselves as being used by institutional power?
On that, I would say it's a both and. But, as I talk about in the book, everybody's mobilized or motivated by personal experiences. It's not a fun industry. It's, part of what Sarah Ahmed critiques is the notion of feel good and feel goodery and happy talk and that sort of thing, because that's the way you can get DEI to happen. DEI work to happen is by making people feel really good about themselves and by harnessing the empathy of others for, poor benighted people. There's a couple of tracks, a couple of ways that DEI people can get work done by appealing to certain sensibilities. But at the end of the day, what drives them to the field is almost universally their own personal experiences inside and outside of institutions with, disempowering, marginalizing systems. I would say no one goes into it totally naive, thinking that they won't run into that. They run into it in their daily lives. Why wouldn't they run into it within these organizations? I say that there are other processes of disillusionment or other motives behind, or there's other impetus for the processes of disillusionment that so many practitioners will inevitably go through. So I think one big one is just politics, weathering the politics. So for example, seeing institutions commit whole hog to, with the sending out these statements of solidarity with Black Lives Matter in summer 2020, and then completely roll back on that, literally roll over 4 years later. I think, for anyone who took institutions at their word, which to some extent I didn't, but I also did, and I know we'll talk about that later, it's really hard in your heart to deal with that, right? Then there's also the piece that you can't do this work if you're completely jaded. I mean, I've met people who are so jaded, it's like you can't even do this work anymore. It's sort of like, it's what Miriam Kaba, that very well-known Black activist, has said. She co-writes this book with Kelly Hayes, also a very well-known organizer and activist, both huge organizers, really, like on the ground doing the work for decades. They say, let this radicalize you because, it's too easy to fall into despair. So let it radicalize you, right? Yeah, take the L, feel shitty, and then get up and then do the work again, right? And that's easier said than done. I would even put myself in that category of people who have repeatedly gone into the DEI field thinking I was ready for what they were going to throw at me, only to feel quite devastated at the sorts of things that I would witness, that I would see, that I would hear, that I would, the kind of things that I would be asked to do on behalf of the senior white leaders of an organization. And it hurt my heart. And it's not because I'm some sort of a wonderful person. It's because there are parts of me that were still really naive and were not resilient enough to bounce back in the face of what felt like abject hypocrisy. The people who are most successful in DEI have an ability to weather the politics. They have an ability to move on a dime, to recognize that the politics at any given moment are going to change what they can and can't do. They have this uncanny ability to maintain hope and optimism even. Let's just say hope. I don't know optimism, but maintain hope in the face of what seems to be conditions of despair, and to stay focused on their mission, even though, in spite of, and maybe even because they keep running up against institutional bullshit that is very much directed at them. I'm in awe of these people. I could never do what they do. I've tried. I can't do it. And I think that to some extent, I would hope that they can appreciate me for doing and being and saying the things that they themselves can't do, be, say.
Reading the chapter, I also couldn't help but think of Mandy Turner, who once wrote a paper describing the hoax of the US-sponsored quote-unquote peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, and the whole fake notion that one day there might be a two-state solution. She described that whole piece as actually a strategy of counterinsurgency meant to pacify the Palestinians while the theft of their land continued apace, and setting the colonial regime up to make its next move when it was ready. You write in this chapter that, quote, under the power-blind diversity regime, structural inequality and institutional whiteness cannot be named. And as a result, diversity practitioners at every level wind up instead playing the part of minority managers, that is, staff who are regularly called on to manage identity-based crises on behalf of all white or majority white faculty administrators and senior leaders in ways that pacify students of color while papering over institutional failings, end quote. How do diversity and inclusion pacify non-white members of historically white colleges and universities?
As you were speaking, I actually started to think about all the critiques of what has been like a year-long quote unquote ceasefire negotiation process between Israel and Palestine.
Bonkers. Yeah.
That we just keep hearing updates every week, like negotiations are in progress, negotiations. And it feels very much like a stalling technique. So, but the thing that I find so interesting is you ask about how that sort of stuff pacifies non-white members of communities. I would actually say that it pacifies dominant members of communities, in the sense that, maybe once upon a time, things like the Multicultural Center, the Center for African American student, Black student union, that sort of thing, was a workable concession that students of color would say, oh, okay, they got my back, before committing to a university. There's a place for me. But I think that there has been so much conversation, maybe too much, that's another conversation, about performativity on the part of not just individuals, but institutions. I think non-white peoples, or just historically marginalized peoples, they walk into these conversations and the veil has already fallen, right? They're not naive. They may, if anything, be expecting performativity. And their first questions are, show me the money, right? In a literal, but also a figurative sense. Like, okay, you have an office, but what funding do they have? Yeah, you have a chief diversity officer, but like, what's the mandate? Yeah, you have staff, but what kind of work, what meetings are they invited into, and that sort of thing. Right. So I think actually the most marginalized members of society have become more savvy in their understanding of performative measures that are about pacifying them, whether or not they use that language. What I think is harder are those who are enamored by efforts of pacification that say, hey, you have a Black student union, what's the issue here? Hey, you have a DEI person, what's the problem, right? Hey, we're having ceasefire negotiations, what more do you want from us, right? And I don't necessarily think that this is about bad people, I think that this is about, and I would characterize myself as one of these people, maybe still, but certainly around certain issues until relatively recently, I would say, yeah, things are happening because they said things are happening, right? And there's a sort of degree of trust, what other people might call naivete or innocence, a degree of trust in people, in systems, degree of trust in people in power that, it's not just because I'm a stupid person. It's not because I'm a stupid woman. It could also be because historically my experiences with certain forms of power have led me to trust certain kinds of leaders and people. And when I think about it, that may not be the experience for other people. So I think that's, again, where the power analysis becomes really important. Yeah, I could sit up here and tell you, like, white people are all about the pacification measures, but it could also be non-white people from very wealthy backgrounds, just people who have different experiences with power and are willing to more fully invest and believe power when power speaks to them, even when sometimes it feels in retrospect that power has lied to them.
I love that. Yeah, that's really paradigm shifting. That makes a lot of sense. I don't know why I never thought of that. I really like something else you write in the book about words that can't be spoken. You write that diversity practitioners are, quote, bringing an equity and justice lens to their work, but they can do so only as long as they avoid words like oppression, inequality, and especially racism. There's an implicit injunction not to speak about racism to protect whiteness from being hurt, end quote. And you also quote a number of diversity, equity, inclusion practitioners in higher education. One said to you, quote, it used to be that you could just deal with racism. Now there's a lot of massaging of language and approach and worrying about who I will offend, end quote. And another told you, quote, white capacity for understanding truths has gone down. DEI work today now requires a lot of coddling bullshit with white people. Diversity practitioners can't call it like it is anymore. That's what's wrong. White people can't stand that they have privilege. You don't have to be mean or rude, but people need to know that they're born into systems of privilege. We need to tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear, end quote. So, I mean, that's really strong. I don't know how else to ask the question. How do white people react when words like racism, oppression, and inequality are raised? Does that connect with this concept of white fragility and generalizing beyond race? Why do privileged people in general so often feign sensitivity about their own insensitivity? Is the breakdown in capacity for dialogue, which we see all throughout society now at every level now, it's so hard to talk to each other. Is that breakdown in capacities for dialogue a function of the increasing challenge to established orders? I know there's a lot there. I think those are three separate questions again.
Well, the first thing you make me think about is this question about words that cannot be spoken. And this is exactly what Sarah Ahmed's work is all about, right? She talks about happy talk, which I mentioned before, or narratives of racial progress. So being able to pursue certain kind of work, as long as you frame it within a narrative of, this institution is on track towards racial progress. Once we were in the dark ages and now we've seen the light, kind of a thing, right? In other words, you can get around using particular words if you adopt other kinds of stories, right? One that I don't know that she talks about quite as much, but one that I've thought about a lot is the hijacking. Well, I don't know if I want to say hijacking, but yeah, I mean, the wielding on the part of DEI practitioners of an appeal to empathy, right? A good mentor of mine at a university, at an R1, she was in DEI work. She has this saying that when I first heard it, I thought, wow, that's pretty awful. But then I started to think about it and I was like, oh, I know what she means. She said about 2020 and the George Floyd protests, she said, basically every crisis is an opportunity. And I thought, well, that's pretty shitty. But I know what she means because the doors to empathy are wide open and then they will slowly close. You have to push as much work through, DEI work through as possible during that limited window because the door is going to close really fast. And it closed even faster than I thought it was going to close. So that can be another conversation for us. But yeah, every crisis is an opportunity. So I would first say that. The second thing I want to say is, you asked this question of how do white people react when words like racism, oppression, and inequality are raised. One thing that I try to bend over backwards doing in the book, I'm really trying to decenter identity. So people who carry an identity as ipso facto reacting and being a particular way. And I'm trying to really recenter these conversations around systems. So I think that that's really important insofar as when we move away from the individual, then we move away from these notions of feigning sensitivity, because I don't think it is feigning. For a lot of people, I don't think it is feigning sensitivity about their insensitivity. I think this is something that a lot of people like James Baldwin has written, also Tracy Cotton McMillan has written about also. There is no better observer of white people than people of color, right? In the sense that once upon a time, and maybe in some context still, your survival, literal survival, could depend on their whims, their feelings. Now it's things like professional survival, right? If you are a DEI person within an institution. And one of the things you learn is sometimes it's not overt insensitivity and it's not feigned. It's genuinely feeling like I've suffered also. And so I don't understand why I'm being asked to send or mobilize more resources, more of my emotional energy towards certain people when I too have suffered. And white people categorically do not have a monopoly on that way of thinking, right? We could broaden the conversation then to people who benefit from all kinds of privilege. If we're sticking with race, I would also say white adjacent peoples, right? People who have benefited from the privileges of whiteness that are defined, that we can define in a particular way, that are advantaged. Certainly people who look like me, people who are East Asian, South Asian, Asian American people, Middle Eastern people, some of whom are, can actually be white passing. Others of us are simply white adjacent. We have really great stereotypes attached to us that we're hardworking, right? These kinds of stereotypes that were weaponized against darker skinned people, specifically African Americans, to say, hey, these immigrants managed to make it. I'm saying that because I want to decenter the notion that any group of people belonging or possessing one particular identity has a monopoly on racism or insensitivity or whatever we want to call it. A. B, I want to make it more about a systems argument. Anyone who has historically throughout their lives benefited from systems that favor whiteness, right? And they're probably going to be more likely to feel that way than other people. And I think thirdly, for those of us who have been up close and personal and had to actually maneuver those interpersonal dynamics, it's not always a farce. It's not always feigned. In fact, the vast majority of the time, it's people who see themselves as good people trying to do their best and are really pissed off that someone's still always pissed at them, right? And that's the balancing act that senior leaders in DEI positions have to manage, because they are simultaneously accountable to communities of color in their institutions, but they have to do the really hard, tough, shitty interpersonal work of working with senior leaders who, white or not white, are not always going to want to be pulled in that direction. And that's why they have to have a super sharp, honed political sensibility that they can live with, you know? So that's the way that I would answer that set of questions.
And that same reframing towards systems may come into play in this next question. Your chapter brings up a longstanding topic, which has been whispered about a lot in activist and other circles, but which is increasingly becoming a subject of open public debate. And that is the question of white women, which is, again, sounds like a question of identity. But in terms of describing how that identity functions systematically, all too often, which is not to say all white women. There was Ruby Hamad's White Tears, Brown Scars. In 2020, it was published, followed by Rafia Zakaria's Against White Feminism and Kyla Schuller's The Trouble with White Women, published 1 year later in 2021. And then a year after that, in 2022, Regina Jackson and Syra Rao published White Women. So a kind of dam has been bursting around this question of whether white women belong as an identity category to the marginalized, as they are generally positioned in contemporary conversation and discourse, or to prevailing systems of oppression, as this new public debate is increasingly proposing. You write, quote, although we rarely discuss it openly, diversity practitioners often encounter problems in their working relationships with white women specifically. Indeed, nearly every woman of color who I interviewed, who served as a diversity practitioner from the 1960s onward, implored me to take a moment in this book to discuss their fraught professional relationships with white women. And you quote one as telling you, quote, white women were quite frankly perhaps as notorious for using their privilege to dismiss the concerns of women of color as white men, end quote. And then you write, she remembered in particular they would talk over her in meetings, and when she raised the issue, she was told, we're just doing what the guys do. In other words, in some white women's quest to fight sexism in the academy, they adopted precisely those patriarchal habits that had once oppressed them, and then wielded their newfound power over women of color. Based on my conversations with today's diversity practitioners, these challenges persist, end quote. So, I mean, I almost wanted to preface this question by saying not all white women. And perhaps you can tease out that nuance in your answer. But the question is, why do white women so often, if not always, seem the most ferocious in their defense of white supremacy? And when they do so, how do they get away with it while also simultaneously positioning themselves so frequently as allies with the oppressed against white male power? I know this is a really hard question.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to answer it in a few different ways. So I'm really glad that you called it a longstanding topic, because it absolutely is. During the year of the Karen, if you will, there were all of these thought pieces or think pieces, whatever, that people were coming out with. One saying that this is sort of a figure, not an imaginary figure, an actual figure that's been around since the days of slavery, right? The Miss Anne figure. Around that same time, a historian wrote a book, Stephanie Jones-Rogers, I think, or Jones-Rogers wrote a book called They Were Her Property. And it was specifically about revealing this history of white slave-owning women who, weren't owning slaves through coverture through their white slave-owning husbands, but who are actually very intimately involved in the day-to-day management of their slaves, even in the purchase and selling of enslaved peoples. And so I think it's just important to point out that historical aspect, and the fact that that book was coming out in around 2020, I think before 2020, so that even in scholarly circles, it is a figment of the imagination, or it remains kind of assumed that in some sort of subjects that white women have been spared some of the ugliness of American history, when in fact that's not true. So I would say that first. Secondly, if we wanted to talk about this from an academic perspective, it really boils down to what, feminist scholars have been talking about for decades now: white feminism versus whatever you want to call it, woman of color feminism, womanism, abolitionist feminism, basically the historical narrowness of white feminism as having excluded from the very beginning Black women and women of color, right? So this is sort of something that is congruous with sort of the historical argument and the scholastic argument. Now I want to move to something that's more on the ground, right? You said that this is something that was whispered about. It is not whispered about in activist and organizing circles. It is something that we talk about very openly because it's very irritating. Talk about the interpersonal interactions with some white women who don't see themselves as raced individuals, who imagine a kind of solidarity that they are at the same time undermining here and there all the time. And I think one example in our current moment is not just sort of the Karen phenomenon, but if you go back to 2016, #MeToo, like, excuse me, Tarana Burke created that. And this was like a Hollywood co-optation specifically by very beautiful white women in Hollywood, kind of erasing the fact that this had long existed for at least a decade, right? And was the product of a Black female activist who had, that was her invention from 10 years earlier. So I think that that's just a really good example of how it's played out on the ground. But I also remember around this time that there was this snapshot taken in Congress of these lawmakers and senators or whatever, and it was Nancy Pelosi and a whole bunch of white guys, and they took a photo, and all these people on social media were like, old white guys. It was specifically white women who were like, old white guys. And I was like, but like, that's a white woman in that room too, So I found it really interesting in the last 10 years that white women like to say, old white guys or white guys, whatever, and yet don't see themselves as white women. So there's kind of like a race blindness as it applies to themselves. So that can often be the case. I guess the last thing I would say from sort of an individual and human perspective, why do we say not all white women, not all white men, not all white people? Sometimes it can feel very irritating, especially when you and I, two people of color, want to just be, we just want to dish. But I think it's important for us to remember that that's not how it operates. And then for me, what I find useful is to say to myself, well, I think it's just the same way that any and all of us are most aware of those moments, of those places, of those things about ourselves where we're disadvantaged. So where we experience disadvantage, where we experience unprivilege, right? So I'm very aware of the fact, and have been for a very long time, that I'm a woman and a woman of color and from a working class background and from an immigrant background, because there's all kinds of stuff that doesn't make sense to me about my society. And it's like, that's because that's some sort of received knowledge or wisdom that I didn't have, or some sort of, something that helps me move with more privilege if I had that particular thing, right? Then again, I've become more aware of the fact that I don't have to think about, for example, what's going to happen to me as an undocumented person, because I'm not undocumented. I have a U.S. nationality, U.S. citizenship. And so I won't have to think about that aspect unless I make a concerted effort, right? I'm cisgender. I don't have to think personally about what's going to happen to myself as a trans person because I'm not a trans person. But that's something I'm going to have to be aware of going into this next administration. And I can go on and on like that, right? And so I think it's something quite similar, that unless you make the effort, and that's what's so hard about making the effort, you have to know enough to even ask the question. So if you don't know what you don't know, how are you going to ask the question? And so I try to come at it from that perspective, right? If you know that, you should probably ask the question and maybe do some thinking about it. I think that's a different scenario. I think that's a different conversation. But if you don't know what you don't know, how can you even begin to ask the question? And if you can't begin to ask the question, then how can you begin to hold yourself accountable and see what comes so naturally to other people, but is going to be hard for you to see?
That leads really well into my next question of identity politics as a whole, which is increasingly being challenged as a mode. And I think that we heard you sidestep around it in these last two questions by shifting focus onto systems as opposed to identities. So you're also, sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, among those challenging identity politics. Polling that came out after the US presidential election showed that the right wing is uniformly against values and concepts that might broadly be called identity politics, but also about half the left is against identity politics. My last two questions would have been criticized for implying that there are hierarchies of oppression and that one is innately oppressed and therefore deserving of repair by virtue of the color of their skin or gender or so on and so forth. I suppose you've already answered this question by talking about the systematic view that you have. But the question is, what would you say to those people who are incredulous at the whole idea of identity politics, who would argue that men are in trouble and need support too, white men are also suffering? Is this question redundant? Or would you have something you would specifically say to them to keep them on side with the DEI agenda or the whatever comes after?
So, there's a whole lot of fantastic scholarship that says that people of color, women, quote unquote, the other, has no monopoly on identity politics. That in fact, we are seeing quite a lot of white identity politics. I think that's the title of many books these days, right? That identity politics is not a left issue. That being said, I still want to decenter the individual. I want to say that I'm thinking about systems and policies that privilege people in certain groups, right? And yeah, sometimes those systems and policies privilege white people. Sometimes they privilege male people. Sometimes they privilege wealthy people. So, that's the way I want to think about it. And insofar as there is this question of people on the left being disillusioned with identity politics, I won't pretend that I understand where everyone's coming from, but I know where I'm coming from. One of the things that has caused me to want to decenter the individual is because of how disillusioned I have grown by someone who's just a black or brown face in a position of power that we somehow expect to change a system, right? And then over and over again, that is not what we see. That's the case within institutions. That's also the case with politics, That doesn't mean that people didn't flip the F out and that we're not living in the white lash moment that his 8 years in power elicited. But, he was what Peniel Joseph calls a redemptionist, whereas Black Lives Matter was Reconstructionist. He was a redemptionist because he believed in the profoundly goodness of racial progress and possibility in America, and that we could get there without talking about the past. Black Lives Matter are Reconstructionists because they say, right? And that Peniel Joseph says, he's saying that Black Lives Matter, they're bringing us into the third moment of Reconstruction. So I say all this because there is a very important critique that people of color are finally having with themselves, and sometimes also more largely, like with in the public, that identity isn't everything. And just as it's not all white people, it's also like not all Black people. There's a saying, skin folk aren't kinfolk all the time, right? You might have the same politics, but you don't necessarily have the same values. Well, you might have the same skin color, but you don't necessarily have the same politics, right? And so, we just need to be more sophisticated in our analysis of that, I think. So I'd hazard a guess that those on the left who are increasingly disillusioned with this concept of identity politics, that might be where they're coming from. And this is all framed within the umbrella statement that insofar as you believe in identity politics, it's happening across the board. It's not a left issue. And then the last thing I'll say on this, because I know I've been going on and on, is to people who say that, who argue that men are in trouble and need support too. Okay, I can go along with that thesis statement. I'll come at it from the Heather McGhee book, The Sum of Us, that says we can't have nice things because we consistently vote in favor of hoarding our own privilege. She's talking specifically about race and white people. She begins with this story of a pool, a community pool that was desegregated, and Black kids were going to be able to swim in the pool. And the white city dwellers said, we'd rather have no pool than have Black kids in our pool. And so it's the same thing. We'd rather get nothing than to open this up. And so it's just the same thing that everyone says. White supremacy hurts all of us. Patriarchy hurts all of us. It tells men that they can't experience their feelings, that they can't connect with their children, that they shouldn't be able to bond with one another, have deep ties of sociability. Hello, male loneliness epidemic. Angus Deaton and his wife, Ann Case, they just discovered within the last 5 years that the growing epidemic of mortality among predominantly white men, right? And in part, this is how patriarchy hurts everyone. So yeah, people need support. We all need to unprogram ourselves from this hateful stuff that we've imbibed.
It sounds like we're going into a bit more of an economic equity issue, which I'd love to explore. But I wanted to ask you about the chapter, because one of the things that keeps coming up in this conversation is this feeling that we're in a political cultural transition moment. And I imagine that I'll quote you first. In the chapter, you write, quote, those who came of age in the late 80s and 90s, that includes myself, participated in anti-apartheid and divestment rallies. Similarly, those of us who came of age in the 2000s may have protested the invasion of Afghanistan. In more recent decades, practitioners have supported and participated in the Black Lives Matter movements. Times change, but we are all marked by our era. We must at all times be attentive to how national political turmoil plays out concretely in the lives of our students. That means we often support students who are in crisis, not only as a result of the academic and social stress they experience on campus, but because of what is taking place off campus, from death, illness, and general strife in their families to the impact of police violence, ICE raids, or deportations in their communities. Because diversity staff approach students holistically, we are better able to connect the dots when, say, their academic performance takes a sudden nosedive during periods of personal turmoil, end quote. I couldn't help but hear the absence in the text of any reference to the genocide in Gaza, and I just presumed that the manuscript must have been completed before Israel began the genocide, and students, first at Columbia and then all across the United States, and then around the world, we had them in Spain, began waves of on-campus protests and occupations to speak out against their own university's complicity with the corporations helping to implement the genocide. Many likened the campus protests to those against the war in Vietnam, and above all, the shockingly harsh crackdowns on the students' right to free speech and assembly by the university administrations themselves, of which DEI practitioners are a part, have led many young people to conclude that the discourse of diversity and inclusion is indeed a farce. Part of that phenomenon, it's complex because there are different parts of it. On the one hand, Claudine Gay, Harvard's first Black president, Manoush Shafiq, Columbia University's first woman president, and Liz McGill, University of Pennsylvania's president, who was also a woman. All three of them were dispatched for insufficiently serving systems of power while also ensuring these crackdowns on student rights on campus. Do you see the campus crackdowns on anti-genocide protesters as an example of your thesis in action?
Yes. Quite simply, let me say, for those of you who is probably everyone listening who are familiar with the publication process, I wrote the proposal for this book in 2020. I wrote up the manuscript in 2021. I got reader feedback in 2022. In 2022, the readers said, you need to tell people what to do with the anti-CRT movement. And I knew enough to know that people weren't even going to be talking about the CRT movement, the anti-CRT movement, by the time this book even came out. And I was right, because in 2023, 24, we were already slipping into the book banning stuff. We were slipping into different kinds of education measures, anti-woke measures. Florida was going nuts. So, and now, in 2024, the total annihilation of DEI departments and legislation against it, including a higher ed. So that's just sort of a little bit of an arc for you. If I had still been writing it in 2024, or even writing up any pieces of the manuscript. Like the manuscript went to press in fall 2023, even summer 2023, right? But if I ever have an opportunity to do a second edition of this book, you better bet your butt it's going to be in a preface or a coda or something, because how do you ignore something like that? So that's the first thing I want to say. I don't want to dance around it. That's what I have to say about that. The second thing is, I hadn't even thought about it, but as you were naming Claudine Gay, but really Shafiq at Columbia, that's another, to go back to the other question. I mean, that's another example of how identity politics don't really get us anywhere. You have a black and brown face, perpetrating systems of violence that are deeply embedded in white supremacy. So I find identity politics to be extremely limited. Like, let's move away from that. The second thing, part of my thesis in this book is that great moments of social progress are followed fast on the heels, that white lash follows fast on the heels of those moments of social progress. And I knew when I was writing the proposal in 2020, I said, we have a window of opportunity, but it's closing. In 2021, I said, it's getting tighter. In 2022, I said, it's about to close. And we're seeing people turn back on some of those promises. And by 2023, it felt shut, right? That's how I felt anyway. And so I'm saying all that to say that I was not going into this bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And even I was shocked at what I saw happening on the campus protests this last year, right? These same leaders who sat in all these DEI trainings, probably starting in 2015, but then also after 2020, and especially after, these high-profile murders of Black and brown people, the entry of the concept of prison abolition into the public domain, which was shocking, whether you like it or not, you knew about it all of a sudden, right? What I thought would have been an understanding of the bias, the specific anti-Blackness of policing. These are the same leaders who are going in the police on their students. Just wild. And even if you didn't get it, the optics, right? The optics of it. I'd spoken to so many of my colleagues at different universities who said that it wasn't just the police on campus to contain the so-called rabble-rousers. There were snipers on roofs. This is sickening to me. And I never would have thought that I don't think I'm naive, but clearly I am. I never would have thought we would have seen that happen. I, who am hyper aware of how hypocritical these institutions and their leaders are, even I didn't think we would go that far because of optics alone. Forget about morality and history and what I thought we had learned. So that's really upsetting. And I will also say that the same way, well, we're going to see in 20, 30 years, I guarantee it, the same way that these institutions fet their participation in moments of racial progress, above all the civil rights movement, right? Berkeley has a free speech cafe, right? To commemorate that movement. Well, guess what? They weren't exactly being commemorated, those protesters, at the moment, right? And then here we are 30, 40, 50 years later, and they say, I'm so proud of what we were able to do as an institution. They immediately assimilate that kind of rebellion, that revolt, that action, right, against the institution. They assimilate it into a narrative of racial progress of how great the institution is. And we're going to see the exact same thing happen in 40 years. That kind of burns my butt, I have to say. I've already heard of librarians at Columbia who are archiving some of the ephemera that is being produced from these protest movements, produced by students, produced by journalists, produced by, images, photographs of what the police are doing. And they're archiving it because they know in 40 years that people are going to want to know what it was like in these encampments, right? And we're going to see exhibits at these institutions, much like the ones that they show off now about like the anti-war protesters, the civil rights protesters of the 60s and 70s. Mark my words.
Yeah, marked. We do have one point of disagreement, and I really want to ask you about it. because I'm curious. You write of a disturbing and growing subgenre in the field of education where faculty of color, especially female faculty of color, describe their challenges navigating the racist and sexist culture of the academy. I have to admit, I find the growth of these stories deeply reassuring. It tells me that I'm in community, I'm not alone. I was up against a system as opposed to personally to blame. What do you find disturbing about this proliferation of stories?
I think there's a miscommunication here in the sense that I find it disturbing that there's become a cottage industry for these kinds of publications, that it is so widespread that we can keep churning these books out. I find it so deeply concerning that nothing is changing and that this stuff has been published since like the early 2000s and still nothing is changing, right? I find it deeply disturbing that as a faculty member, I teach at a university here and we have these women of color faculty groups. I find it deeply disturbing that we're still at the point where we are commiserating about these interpersonal interactions, whether it be with students or fellow colleagues or whatever, and that we're still having trouble getting past just the experiential shock of it all. Or maybe it's not even, that's the point, is that it's no longer a shock. It's so disturbingly common, right? That's what I meant when I said a disturbing genre, is that it's disturbing because we're still in the same moment after 20 years of being like, what is going on? What is wrong? And I sort of feel the same way about diversity and inclusion stuff. Why isn't it working? It's like, well, because we're not saying the thing, right? We're not at liberty to say the thing. We're not at liberty to have a power analysis. And the power analysis would be things like institutional whiteness and white supremacy, right? I think one thing that gets us closer there is this book, Community as Rebellion. Lorgia Pena, it was a Haymarket Books publication, which tells you a lot right there. And it's this wonderful combination of memoir experience, what it's like to be a Latina from a certain kind of background, navigating these selective white institutions. And she names the things, she says white supremacy. She actually says those things. So it goes beyond experience, and it talks about, here we go again, the historical construction of the academy, the historical construction of the academy, not just as an institution, but as manufacturer of knowledge. That is a book that only came out, I want to say, in the last 4 or 5 years. But that was the first time that I saw something different out there, right? And this isn't to say that people aren't allowed to have their experiences. Yes, have your experiences, but it's telling to me that the conversation hasn't moved on. What it tells me is that we haven't come up with solutions, that people aren't paying enough attention, that people who have power to change this haven't been paying enough attention. So that's why it's disturbing to me.
Would you posit that, similar to the other things we discussed, this growing subgenre of people talking about their experiences suffering the racist and sexist culture of the academy is actually permitted as a kind of release valve? So you can complain about how badly we're treating you, as long as you don't join up and force us to make concessions to stop mistreating you.
And that is exactly, one of the chapters begins that way. It says, hey, universities have gotten really good at having these like racial affinity groups for Black students, for Latinx students, whatever. And these are spaces where students can find community, where they can say, this is what happened and made me feel this way. But it's exactly that. The institution doesn't need to change because the kids are getting together and they're talking about how sad they are and angry they are. And that, from one perspective, furnishing community and making, as you said, making me feel less alone, on the flip side, is doing nothing to challenge the system. And also, the people who are producing that genre are the least well-placed to change the system. So it's like, it's just all kinds of messed up.
Okay, how to change things and move forward. In the chapter that we've been discussing, you don't address this, but in the book at large, you do. And the title itself, Getting from Diversity and Inclusion to Equity and Justice in Higher Education, suggests a shift from diagnosis to prescription. What would equity and justice in higher education look like beyond token representation?
So for this, I talk extensively about it in chapter 7. So throughout, right, my main critique is that that the diversity inclusion critique system exists in a power blindness regime, right? So we need a regime that sees power, that acknowledges power, right? And for me, power is the outcome of history. So that for me is where we need to begin. We need to begin by reckoning with the past. And for me, the framework that does the best job of helping us reckon with the past so that we know what to do for the present and imagine new futures is the framework of restorative justice. And restorative justice, my understandings of restorative justice are really, really influenced by Mariame Kaba and others. And what it says is you have to acknowledge that something actually happened. You have to acknowledge that something is wrong, right? And after acknowledging, then you need to actually repair, right? And so one example is at a much larger level, reparations. Well, people in the US say, oh, reparations can't happen. It's already happened. Like the US has offered reparations to Japanese Americans who were confined in internment camps during World War II. So it's not just a global phenomenon. It's happened here in the US. It's happening. It's happened in municipalities here, like in Chicago, I think was one of the first ones, right? The first municipality to do that. This is happening. It's not even shocking, right? So it's an acknowledgement of histories of dispossession, marginalization, and to be quite frank, impoverishment, right? Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls this organized abandonment. It's acknowledgement that happened through very specific historical processes, not by accident, all right? For specific reasons. So it starts there. Then repair. What are you going to do about it, right? Sometimes reparations looks like money. Sometimes it looks like something else. So for example, up until the affirmative action decision, one idea for what to do, and one idea that was put into practice that was implemented was by a theological seminary in Virginia that was constructed by through enslaved labor. And one of the things that they sought to do, the administration, was to offer reparations to the descendants of those who had literally built the university. And so that started a few years ago, right? I don't know if it's still happening. I don't know if it will be allowed to continue happening. But my point is that there are these experiments, right? So that's acknowledge, then repair, and then restore. And I think the restoration piece has a lot to do with making peace with the communities that we've harmed in the past, not just through material measures, but also thinking about how can we restore and be in community with those communities again. So for example, a lot of communities were whole hog destroyed, University of Chicago being one of them, or displaced at minimum, USC another, Yale another. Just basically these places were expanding and pushing out marginalized populations, right? What do we owe to those people? What do we owe to our local community when I'm speaking as the institution, are the ones that contributed to their organized abandonment, that impoverished these communities, that contributed to their marginalization. So yeah, in chapter 7, I break down the restorative justice framework. I talk about acknowledge, repair, restore, and I talk about actually existing experiments in restorative justice that have already been implemented at a variety of higher ed institutions. And part of it is because I'm trying to say, yes, prescriptive, as you said, yes, prescriptive, but not prescriptive in terms of do this, prescriptive in the sense of these are the values that need to guide us. Here are some examples. It's a choose your own adventure. Find the one that makes sense for your institution. And it's a lot harder than it seems.
So for you, equity and justice build on diversity and inclusion. They don't replace them.
I think it has to build on it just because diversity and inclusion stuff has been there for a long time. I think that, there's like critical mass theory that as soon as you have enough quote unquote diversity, you have enough people saying the things that they were saying behind closed doors, but now they're saying it openly, like the whole genre, quote unquote disturbing genre, written by women faculty of color, right? And then once you say the things, now we're ready for the equity and justice part, right? So you gain critical mass. Thanks to that, you can now have spaces where you feel inclusion and belonging, like racial affinity groups. Now what? Now what is the institution going to do so that the burden of the feeling of included is displaced onto the institution, which has a lot more power to stop manufacturing the conditions in which people feel excluded, and not just feel excluded, are excluded. So that's, if you want to see it as a continuation, it's that. If for no other reason than because diversity and inclusion has been there for 30 years, it's not going away. So we need to build on top of it.
So is the ball totally in the court of the university administrations, or are there things that students, faculty, and DI practitioners can do to push their institutions towards restorative justice?
I mean, if you would ask me in 2014 and 2020, I would have been a little bit more hopeful about senior administrators. You know, I wrote this book in part to them, being like, here, I'll explain this to you, you know, but I don't really feel that way anymore. And there's, you know, I can't remember who said it now, but it's something along the lines of people in power rarely give up that power willingly, right? It just doesn't happen. And no institutional leader is going to invite chaos into their regime. The only way it works is for marginalized people to push their agenda. That's why organizing exists. That's why activism exists. Is it fair? No. Is it fair that those who are the most marginalized has to take time out of their lives and schedules to educate people and fight for what's right? No. Is that how life works? Yes. And I'd say that one of the things that's really hard, one of the things that I try to underscore is what made organizing during the civil rights movement, during the student protest movements of the 60s and 70s so successful. There were multiracial coalitions. There were coalitions that involved faculty. There were coalitions that involved not just students and faculty, but all community members, because everyone's fate is linked, right? So it's not just graduate students wanting contracts and having labor demands, but like, what do you have in common with the janitors, right? Custodial staff of your institutions? What do you owe them, right? Because this is, so I think thinking in terms of those solidarities as well, so that we're chipping away at like the classism and whatnot, right? So those are the things that we have, that need to be defining features, because that's what helped the civil rights movement. And then there just needs to be really good organization on the ground. And that's really hard, because the nature of universities is that students are rotating in and out virtually every 4 to 8 years or whatever, 4 to 6 years, whatever it might be. And I can speak from personal experience that in these colleges and universities, they would say to one another, we just got to wait it out until so-and-so graduates, and then so-and-so would graduate and things would calm down and they say, oh, phew, until the next one rises up and, agitates and all that kind of stuff. And so that's really what students are up against. So what they need is help from alumni that keep putting pressure on these institutions. If you have the strength and the resources to organize as a lobby, you can get stuff done. If you're in total disorganization and disarray, you're not going to get anything done. And for students who are often, are able to be the organizers in these spaces, they're at a disadvantage because with any luck, they're also gone in 4 to 6 years. So what do you do? And not all faculty, tenured faculty maybe, but increasingly we're seeing the adjunctification of faculty. They scarcely have the time, energy, or privilege to be able to put it all on the line in that kind of way, which really puts the onus on tenured faculty to do that organizing work, to be the institutional memory for when students cycle in and out. That takes a rare and special kind of person.
Indeed.
No, but also, Frantz Fanon and others, there's a lot of critique about, those who, like the powerless or those in power don't get to decide how those without it revolt or something like that. Like, it's kind of all those things. Like, you can merge like anti-colonial critique by someone like Frantz Fanon with the kinds of critiques that come out of Black feminists in the United States also, right? It's just that, excuse me for speaking in flowery terms, but, Paulo Freire-esque terms, but we, the dispossessed, aren't going to revolt on your terms. It's like, when people get mad at protesters because they shut down freeways, it's like, yeah, The point of protest is disruption. Like, it's supposed to make people uncomfortable and it's supposed to disrupt and interrupt. That's the point of protest. So if it inconvenienced you, that is a mark of success of a protest, you know? So just all of that, all of that.
You said at some point that you couldn't do the work of a DI worker, but you hope that they appreciate you saying the things that they can't. What did you mean by that?
When you work within organizations, you have to think far more about politics. You have to not rub people the wrong way. You can't ruffle feathers, at least not the important people, right? The ones who are your bosses and the senior leaders. Senior leaders, by the way, of institutions are disproportionately white. So, so there's like a systemic, again, angle to this, right? And that's really hard. I don't know if it was this chapter, but I listed off, there's sort of this litany of microaggressions that students that I really cared about were experiencing. And, this student was told by career services, talk about your urban high school experience. She's like, I'm not urban. Like, or this Asian American student, they said I was a shoe-in because I wasn't a quiet Asian girl and that made me feel weird. Well, yeah, that would make you feel weird, right? Just all these things. And the implicit injunction is to help my students work through their feelings. But after enough of these interactions that my students were telling me about, and who knows about all the ones they weren't telling me about, or the students who I didn't know who were experiencing this. And this was in the 21st century. I was, at a meeting with career services, and it was ostensibly to talk about, how do we get your students to come more? And I said, well, I think your people need anti-racist training. And then I proceeded to offer some examples. Now, on the one hand, there are people who say you shouldn't have brought it up. On the other hand, people who say you should have befriended these people over the course of many, many years and then brought it up. There are people who would say you should have said it in a different way and not even use the word race or racism or anything like that. Those are all different choices, different political choices that can be made, that should be made by different people, that will be made by different people. It's not the choice that I made. And it's because I believe in being direct and saying the thing. And I don't say that to fet myself. I say that knowing that it is a great liability in this world, and also knowing that I just don't sound authentic and I don't even make sense when I try to be political, when I try to be really diplomatic. I get lost in my own words because I'm trying to be something that I'm not. I'm trying to say the thing that the other people need me to say. And that's just not one of my strengths. I have other strengths. One of my strengths is telling it like it is. So working outside of organizations lets me do exactly that. And that weakness inside institutions is my consummate strength when I'm outside institutions. And it took me a long time to be okay with that. It took me a long time to accept myself and not see this as a personality deficit. And frankly, to square it with my understanding of how change can happen. It's not just organizations and institutions. It's also organizing that takes place outside, And so a lot inside of me had to change. My understanding intellectually of how things happen have to change. I had to grow up a lot.
I think there's a very long historical tradition in the field of philosophy, speaking about the importance of connecting language with meaning and warning about the perils of when language and meaning get disconnected, that would really support you in saying it like it is. I wanted to ask you, there were a few other things you mentioned that we didn't have a chance to elaborate on. You spoke about how your friends said that every crisis is an opportunity, and you wanted to talk about how quickly the door closes. I wanted to hear more about what you meant by how quickly the door closes.
So this scholar, Lauren Lesage-Shepard, has just recently written this amazing book. I think it just came out in the last couple of years. And she talks about the counter-organizing on the right that took place in the 60s and 70s. So while in the 60s and 70s, the left was creating its own SNCC and whatever else, in order to build out their organizational structure so that they could have this national network of peoples that could pursue their civil rights goals, their particular anti-racist social justice agenda. At the same time, the right was coalescing around the anti-agenda, the anti-left agenda. And she just does this remarkable job of showing how this was the case on campus, how this was the case in terms of institutions that were founded during that period, how these institutions directed the flow of money to like Republican clubs on these campuses. You know, she has this really interesting book and that talks about the excellent counter organizing and sort of counter movement that developed, especially over the course of the 80s. Meanwhile, journalists have been doing a lot of good work unearthing the excellent counter-organizing at the local level that the far-right Republican Party has been doing for the last 10 or so years. And that is what explains so much of the quickness, what felt very much like an onslaught of legislative attacks that were so successful to bring down DEI and to ban books and to shutter entire programs and, you know, just to end tenure, to defund entire. I mean, I was once again surprised, not that these movements existed, but that they were so profoundly successful. And it was only when I realized how thoughtful and well organized the far right has been in not just this domain, but many others. That's what accounts for their success right now. And that's a real bummer. And I want to see the left get to a point where they can counter organize. Right now, the talk in progressive circles, one thought that I'm having is that there is such a profound disenchantment with the political landscape and even with certain kinds of policy advocacy and that sort of thing, that it's just not leading to where it needs to go, that we've almost turned away from all that. The emphasis is on mutual aid, solidarity, and helping and lifting one another up at a local level because we just can't even count on anyone anymore, right?
You wanted to talk a little bit more about sometimes absolute performativity, which is now baked into the behavior of these institutions, and individuals are now expecting them to be performative. Do you want to say more about that?
I don't have anything particularly sophisticated to say, but it's very similar to what I said about land acknowledgements in chapter 7, which is the major critique is, and now what? You know, words don't really mean much. What about land back? Put your money where your mouth is. My take on that is yes, and we got to start somewhere. You know, if we dwell in the land acknowledgement space for another 20 years, that's a problem. But if we can at least begin with land acknowledgement, I mean, that's the first part of the restorative justice framework. Acknowledge. Now let's talk about repair and restore, right? I don't know. That kind of incrementalism on my part is what makes me an outsider in a lot of progressive circles. So, as opposed to other thoughts and ideas, such as all of them contained in this book, which makes me a radical in more traditional circles. So,
yeah, we spoke so much about multiculturalism, racism, institutional whiteness. When you think about restorative justice and repair and a reconstructivist agenda, how much of that is really just an economic piece that's missing, a rising tide that could lift all boats, including, you know, poor whites and poor men.
I've often thought of DEI as the rising tide that lifts all boats. My perspective has been in the classroom. You know, in the classroom, we talk a lot about hidden curriculum, the importance of making policies transparent, the importance of making college going as an experience transparent. You know, we think that that's going to help the students who are from non-traditional backgrounds. Well, guess what? The students from traditional backgrounds, they don't know all that stuff either, you know? So DEI or inclusive teaching, whatever you want to call it, as the tide that lifts all boats, is going to help everyone improve their academic performance, right? Not just the kids of color or the low-income students. I think that there's a certain applicability, but there are also limits, you know? There have been studies that I'm aware of. Derek Bach, a book that came out in the 90s, you know, maybe there's research that undermines this now, but at least at that time, their opinion was that a colorblind approach that focused singularly on class wasn't going to do it, wasn't going to make the cut. And admissions officers themselves, in preparation for the Supreme Court affirmative action decision, they mobilized. They started trying to figure out all kinds of ways that they could subvert, circumvent, or maybe enhance the new protocols that were going to come down to them after that Supreme Court decision. So, I'll change my mind if you show me the money. Like, go do a study on it. If you do in the book, I write that the SAT is racist and we need to get rid of it because it disproportionate. Well, guess what? They just did some research and they said that that's not the case. So, okay, well, that didn't come out until after the book went to press. So, when I do the second edition, I'll still say it was racist, but I'll, in terms of its historical legacy, but maybe it gives people hope because maybe it's the kind of historically rooted practice that we can change, So yeah, I'm willing to change my mind if you show me the data.
I want to ask you two quick questions before we wrap up about the dedication and the preface. You dedicated the book to your father, but you didn't just say to your father. You said specifically, for my father, who taught me that standing up for what you believe in always pisses people off, but sometimes you've got to do it anyway. And then you also quote Mariam Kaba, who said, history is instructive not because it offers us a blueprint for how to act in the present, but because it can help us ask better questions for the future. Why that dedication to your father and why that quote from Mariam Kaba?
So at the most basic level, my first book about immigration, gender, welfare in France, that was dedicated to my mother because it really encapsulated her experience, not in France, but in the United States as like a single woman, immigrant woman trying to raise a girl daughter in a community where expats were not very supportive. And instead, she had to rely on sort of these multiracial solidarities amongst neighbor women and state supports for mothers to make it. This one is dedicated to my dad. And I'll say we have, for most of my life, been on opposite ends of the political spectrum. But the one thing we've had in common is that we have a very strong sense of what's right and wrong. He's come around to my way, which I think has opened up all kinds of possibilities in terms of personal relationships. But I will simply say that my dad and I have this in common, that we feel acutely the pain of what we feel is a certain kind of moral clarity and allergy to hypocrisy. We feel very acutely the pain of trying to remain who we are, remain true to ourselves, and fight for what we think is right while also trying to exist in the world. And, I think that that's something that to some extent all DEI practitioners share, because that's, to some extent, they all have to figure out the politics of their institution. And it hurts. For me anyways, it hurts a lot to have to make certain kinds of concessions that feel wrong and make me feel like I'm not just not being true to myself, but that I'm selling out to some extent, I appreciate the people that can make those decisions, and nothing would get done without them. It comes down to, how do you think change happens inside or outside institutions? But it really hurts. It hurts at an individual level. It pisses people off. It has serious ramifications and consequences for your life. I mean, in terms of whether you can support yourself or not in the field of your choice, and it's really hard. And sometimes I've decided that I just have to do it anyway, no matter how much it makes me sad and cry about the life that I maybe wanted to live not being possible because of the decisions that I've chosen to make, because I can't live with myself if I don't make them. And then in terms of Mariam Kaba, first of all, she's come up multiple times, so she's basically my guru. And I just think it's important, while I repeatedly reference what happened in the 60s and 70s and say that we need to return to that social justice imperative, my point is also that the work didn't last then and it won't last now if we don't do something different. So how can we look at what didn't work, not just what did work, like the multiracial coalitions and the use of more specific power-conscious analysis and that sort of thing? Not just what did work, but what didn't work. And what didn't work was a lack of courage, a lack of vision, bowing to whitelash. And yet here we are. Not everyone. The guy from Costco who's in charge, he says, I'm going to maintain my DEI programs. That's pretty awesome. So it's not everyone, It's easy to be jaded, but there are these places and there are all these organizations and there are these people who say, nuh-uh, the times are changing, but this is still what I believe in. And so that can give us hope for the future in times of despair, I think.
I really wanted to thank you for your courage and your vision in this conversation. You were so honest and forthright, and I really, really appreciated it. It's been a really, really beautiful conversation, and speaking of giving me hope, has also given me hope. So thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That was Dr. Nimisha Barton, and that was the first episode of Sustainability Matters. As always, you can also participate. Tell us what you think of the Sustainability Matters podcast. If you would like us to cover any specific topics in this format in future episodes, or if you have thoughts on the limits of inclusion in higher education that you'd like us to take up, write to us and let us know. We're at podcast@brill.com, and we would love to hear from you. If enough of you write to us about equity and justice in higher education or any other topic related to sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond, we do promise to explore it in another episode. For now, I will say thank you, as always, for being with us. I'm still your host, Ramsey Nasser, and I will see you again next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.